Hey, good evening. This is Jordan with Not a Tame Sheep, and we have Brian tonight from the Church Split. So we're going to chat a little bit about two passages. I've been watching Mike Winger's series on the role of women in ministry and egalitarianism and soft complementarianism. And Mike seems to say, my understanding is that the two passages that have kept him from being egalitarian, at least in the church, is 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2. And in our apologetics group, Abby Brim kind of cheered me on to do a video about it. So here I am. So I asked Brian to come along and we can just talk our way through these two passages and see if we can give you some information before Mike covers these passages, because I think he's going to be doing that next. So you want to introduce yourself a little, Brian? And
Yeah, happy to be here, Jordan. We work together quite a bit with the Black Sheep Theology Network, and my co-host Will on the Church Split is. You guys were friends first, and Will introduced me to you, and we've had many a fun conversation about several different topics. So, excited for your new YouTube channel, and happy to be here to chat some theology. We probably agree and don't agree, so that'll be kind of fun.
Yeah, I think right now we're not in the same place. So I know we disagree a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Nope.
So let's just go through these two passages, and I'll give you my perspective on it, and you can give me yours, and people can decide for themselves, right?
Sounds good.
So 1 Corinthians 14, this is Paul's writing to the Corinthians, of course. There's two different books of Corinthians. When I look through, I have N.T. Wright's book, the New Testament in its context, or it's his newer one. It's a giant thing. So I read through that, looked at some of what he said about this. He said that there were at least 7 letters between the Corinthians and Paul. So the church was writing to Paul, and Paul was writing back. You know, when you read through his letters, he was addressing things that he had heard. So somehow he had heard those things. So either people had traveled through Corinth and then met up with Paul and told him word of mouth, or the N.T. Wright thing about 7 letters. I have no idea if that's accurate or not. I'm just telling you it's there, and it makes sense. If Paul can send them a letter, maybe the post office ran both ways.
Probably a little slower than us, but I don't know, maybe not.
So anyways, so that's kind of the background that I'm coming from, that there were letters between Corinth and Paul, and that this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, that he had information somehow, either from word of mouth or from them sending him letters that he was writing back to them. So 1 Corinthians 14, I was telling you, I was listening to Preacher Boys, Eric, and he was having a discussion. Yeah, I know you. Did you go back and listen to that?
I did.
So it was, I don't think we need to bring up names, but, the pastor that was on there just said, we're Baptists and we take the Bible literally. It's like, this is what it says, so this is what we do. So when I look at 1 Corinthians 14, I'm not King James only, but I read it in the King James. I've looked at it in multiple different translations, because I don't think that there's any reason it's wrong to do that. And of course, I looked at it in the Greek. So when I look at it in the Greek, there's the Greek word, and I don't know Greek. I can read through it and look up the words and everything. It uses the same Greek word throughout chapter 14. It's like andiamo. And then there's another way that it's not exactly like that, but it's like plural or something. So, I'm not going to pull it up and look at it, but it uses the same word throughout. So, like in look at verse 20, 1 Corinthians 14, verse 20. In the NIV, it says brothers and sisters. And of course, the NIV tells you that they're being gender inclusive. So when you look, you look at that in the ESV, it only says brothers.
Yeah.
Verse 26 in the NIV, what shall we say, brothers and sisters? But it's the same word throughout. So if it's only brothers, which is what the text says, so let me switch over to the ESV. So verse 26, what then, brothers, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or 3 at most, each in turn, let someone interpret. So, that runs down until verse, 33? As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches. So when I look at verse, 26, I look through the whole chapter. It's the same Greek word every time, endiamo. It's translated brothers. It means brothers. If women are to be silent, and in verse 26, Paul tells us what the brothers are supposed to do. The brothers are to sing the hymns. The brothers are to teach the lessons. The brothers are to give the revelation. The brothers are to speak in tongues, and the brothers are to do an interpretation. So if you're going to say that women can't teach, then women can't sing. If women can't, give a lesson, then women can't sing. If women can't give a revelation, then women can't sing. If women can't speak in tongues, then women can't sing. Do you see my point? That
yes and no.
if you're going to take it literally, this is what the text says. The text, means what it says. Paul gives a list of the things that the brothers are supposed to do, and then says women are to be silent. So to me, if you're going to say, it's literal, it, says what it means what it says, and women can't do any of those things, they can't do all of them. So if you won't go to a church where a woman is preaching, you shouldn't go to a church where a woman is singing. If you're going to be, consistent. So, so I look at it that way, that you're either going to have to take it that way, or like what N.T. Wright says, I think it's 1 Corinthians 7, Paul talks about women doing something in the church where they are not silent. So, he commands women to do this. Well, how are women supposed to do that thing if they're silent? And it's not just the NIV that translates this. Further up in the chapter, it'll say brothers and sisters. In the ESV, they footnote it. Verse 14:6, or brothers and sisters. Also verses 20, 26, and 39. So if this is brothers and sisters, then to me, it's a contradiction for Paul to have women doing all of these things. He has women singing. He says, I want all of you to speak in tongues. Well, how are women speaking in tongues and then silent? So when I look at, when I get to this verse where it says, women are to be silent. So that's verse, verse 33. So
yeah, 34.
Right. So I looked that up. I'm like, he says, "For they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says." I'm like, well, where in the law does it say that women are not allowed to make a peep? you know? So I looked that up, I mean, we have Google now.
Yeah.
So, and what I found is that this law that Paul is referring to comes from the Talmud. It's not even Mosaic law. It's Talmudic law. And to me, when I look at the rest of the New Testament and what Paul says about the law, that doesn't make any sense to me. That Paul is using Talmudic law to tell the women that they can't sing, they can't teach, they can't share, they can't do any of those things, when he says earlier in the letter that they are supposed to. So when I read about, what N.T. Wright said, that there are multiple letters going back and forth, it makes sense to me that because earlier in the letter, Paul talks about the Judaizers that are coming in and trying to lead the church astray.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that they do that is they're trying to make them conform to the Jewish religion. So what makes sense to me is that Talmudic law says that in church, then, women are to be silent because that's what the Talmud says. So the church in Corinth wrote a letter to Paul and said, this is what this is what the law says. Is this, this is what we're being told. So what I think is going on here is Paul, he explained to them the order, how women and men are to behave in church, with singing, with with the hymns, with lessons, with revelations, with tongues, with interpreting. Let all these things be done for building up. He wants them all to do it. That's brothers and sisters, that's men and women doing all of those things. And then he quoted back to them the thing that they sent in their letter. So they sent this question to him. We're being told that in the church, all the churches, or this is our recommendation because of the law, that women are to be in submission and they're to be silent in church. So he rebukes them. He says, was it from you that the word of God came, that you can make up rules like this and tell the women that they can't sing, they can't instruct, they can't speak in tongues, they can't give a revelation, they can't do anything. They have to be silent and ask their husband at home. So to me, that makes sense of the chapter, that thing that sticks out, that just seems so weird, that Paul would go from being against, Galatians, it's like you're free of the law. But I'm going to write the Corinthians and tell them that this part of the Talmudic law still applies to all the churches. So does that make sense? Do you have questions, or what do you think?
That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. And just so everyone knows, like, I hold this belief with an open hand. I grew up in a church that had women pastors. And it wasn't actually until I met my wife, who was a good Baptist girl, who was like, no, that's not right. And I was like, what do you mean it's not right? So we had a few different discussions about it, and I didn't change my mind right then, but over time I was like, oh, okay, I can see where, being confronted with these two chapters is one of them, going, okay, well, how do you get around that, as you said, Mike Winger said. So
yeah, I don't know if Mike said, how do you get around it? But
T. Wright said.
Yeah, listening to his series, I think, what he's saying is that he would have been egalitarian except for 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2. And that's my kind of language that, because you hear that all the time, how do you get around this?
Yeah.
How do you get around Romans 9? How do you get around 1 Corinthians 14? How do you get around 1 Timothy 2? And then, people say, well, how do you get around 2 Peter 3? God wills all people to be saved. How do you get around that? So it's, it's just a common phrase. I don't know if Mike said that, but
I think I would go up the chapter a little bit, maybe to verse 28, just to kind of add some context, because there again, it talks about keeping silent. So in verse 28 it says, but if there is no one to interpret, I'm also using ESV, let each of them keep silent in the church and speak to himself and to God. So, and I'm of the opinion, this is talking about tongues in this chapter, that tongues meant speaking in other languages. And right, Corinth is kind of like a New York City in biblical times, where there's just a melting pot of different cultures and languages. And so it seems like it would make sense that speaking in tongues would be speaking in different languages. And I think you look at Pentecost, when everyone, they're speaking in tongues, as in they're speaking and people from different languages are understanding it, even though they're speaking only one sentence or only one phrase, not the same sentence multiple times. So that's my at least understanding of tongues. So when you say in verse 28, there's no one to interpret, so if no one interpret the language in which you're speaking, then let them keep silent, because otherwise you're literally just blabbering to the wind. Everyone's like, okay, I don't know what he's saying. We've probably all been in times where someone's speaking different language, like, well, I don't know what he said. Or the movie without the subtitles, you're like, I don't know what he's talking about. So I think that adds some context to here, and then you continue. So let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. So again, we have this silent term. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and be encouraged. So this is idea of how do we keep order in the church? It sounds like Paul's kind of addressing either people are talking at the same time, or they're talking a language that no one understands. And then verse 32, and the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. So they are creating confusion and saying that God is not an author of confusion, not a God of confusion, but of peace. Okay, so there, and then we continue, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches. Okay, so we have the same idea of keeping silent, for they are not permitted to speak. So, kind of look at, okay, what is the Greek word silent? I don't know how you'd say it, sigaio, keep silent. But I thought one other interesting usage was hold one's peace. So that's how I would kind of read it, as hold one's peace, hold one's opinion, and the other usage is be concealed. So you could say that it's an utterance, right? He says not permitted to speak would be laleo is the word it's using. So there's a lot of usage for that one. Utter voice, emit a sound. So like, okay, how literal are we getting? They can't make a peep, like you said, even sing. But I thought one of the other usage was interesting, which is use words in order to declare one's mind and disclose one's thoughts. So that's how I would interpret it from my perspective. Like I said, held with an open hand, and I'm not legalistic about this at all. I'm just trying to be submissive to what Scripture's saying and how I understand it, but I could come to a different understanding too. But it seems like it's saying, hey, women, and I think we would color it with 1 Timothy chapter 2, which we're going to get to, is this authority idea, this exercising of opinion. Hey, you guys, and I could even be gracious enough and say, hey, maybe he's talking about a specific instance. Hey, you women right now who are causing confusion, causing chaos in the church, I need to keep silent because you're creating chaos. And he's saying, as in all the churches, we have this kind of hierarchical order in the churches of who can speak when. And there's some evidence that the churches in the 1st, 2nd century had some separation of services. So the men were together and the women were together. So maybe that was mixing of some hierarchy structure that they had at that point in time. But yeah, and then in verse 35, it says it's shameful for them to speak in the church. So, and I think, looking at that, okay, the church, are we talking about a specific building, ecclesia? Okay, so it's the gathering of the body of believers at that time. So I just don't know how to steal the same phrase. I don't know how we get around that specifically when it's the word for woman, gune, it's only for women. And I think I could follow you with the brothers and sisters stuff earlier. I would interpret that as brethren, right? The body, like the fellow believers, which would include men and women. But just as a general thing, just like I would walk into a room and say, hey guys, but it's everybody, right? So I could speak in general terms about the whole congregation while specifically excluding certain roles from certain people. And I don't think that would be necessarily a contradiction.
So what do you think about the the reason that is given is the law?
Yeah, I didn't look up that reference and what you said from the Talmud on what it would be. I honestly don't have an opinion on that part. It sure
Yeah,
seems
that's
like as a former Pharisee was trying to use the law to convince them that this was the way.
yeah. I mean, there's other. I think that's like generally accepted that there were Jews that were trying to Judaize. Like
Oh yeah,
like saying that Gentiles had to be circumcised. So that this would be, in my mind, a similar thing where Jews have come into the church and they're like, "Hey, you guys are breaking the law here by allowing women to speak." And so, I've heard a lot of people use the it was only for that time until I just I have a problem with the with that way of getting around it because the reason that's given is the law. Why
yeah,
would the law change? Because they're already under, at this point, they're already under the law of Christ because, at Pentecost. So I guess that's why I have trouble with that explanation. It just makes sense to me that either it's got to be full authoritarian, that everything is restricted, and women are silent, no singing, nothing. And, again, we have a problem with Philip having 4 daughters who are called prophetesses. How are they to be prophetesses if they can't, you know, it's shameful for them to speak, you know?
yeah,
So, I'm just trying to make sense of everything, and I think, this passage kind of sticks out as a sore thumb. Just, weird that Paul would even say this. It is how it looks to me. So that's why I think that it's it was sent to him in a letter saying that this is what we're being told, or this is a rule that we're thinking should be implemented. Maybe one of the Jews that had come into the church wrote a letter to Paul, and that's what he said, as in all the churches, women should be silent. Why isn't this going on? And then Paul rebukes it. Um,
yeah,
and if that's the case, then anyone that is saying that women should remain silent, they're doing the exact opposite of what Paul wanted. So I don't know. It's how I look at it. It's how it makes sense to me to make, everything in the New Testament that Paul has written work together.
yeah. Now,
So
what I do get from your perspective, like if you look at 1 Corinthians 7, right? There is a quote that he's referencing, right, where they say,
yeah,
um, "For it's not good for a man to touch a woman," and he responds to it and says, "No." Opposite of that, married men and women should be touching each other, and so much so they should be withholding it from each other. I just don't see that here in the text. It doesn't seem like he's responding to that if it's a quote. Maybe where would you pull that out, or do you see him responding to if 33 through 35 is quoting what they said?
well, I mean, different. I think if you look, like in the NRSV, that that verse from "as in all the churches" to "are you the only ones that has reached" is in parentheses. So, um, I've heard people say that this is like offset in the text. Either, it's not in the earliest versions, or it appears in the margins sometimes. But I had somebody say to me, "Have I looked at scans of all of the, all of the originals and seen that?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't. Somebody told me."
Yeah,
Just like I'm going by what N.T. Wright said, that there were at least 7 letters that went back and forth. I don't know.
sure.
I guess, when I look at what Paul says about the law, and, like in Acts, when the Gentiles came in and they went to the disciples and they said, what should we tell them? And, we tell them the only thing that they need to refrain from, is not eating meat sacrificed to idols and eating blood. That's all that applies to them. So then to have something from the Talmud apply just doesn't seem consistent with Paul. And if it's not consistent with Paul, would indicate, especially and with the rest of the letter, where Paul tells women to do things that would be the exact opposite of his command for them to be silent. It just, to me, there's just so many indications that this is something that someone has come into the church and said, this is what we should do. It was sent to Paul. Paul tells them, look, everybody is supposed to be doing this. Here's what you said to me. No, that's wrong. It's rejected.
Yeah, that's what I'm just saying is, where's the no, it's wrong part? Do you see that?
Well, because he says, did the word of God originate with you? You're coming up with rules for all of the churches, as in all the churches of the saints. So you're coming up with a rule that this rule should be implemented in all the churches of the saints, that women should be silent. And Paul rebukes them by saying, did the word of God originate with you? Are you the only ones that has reached that you can make a rule for all of the churches of the saints that women are to be silent? That's how it reads to me. I mean,
but then if you go,
makes it consistent with everything else.
Well, I would say it would make it consistent with our next chapter, First Timothy chapter 2, because he says, right, I do not permit it. So, but I want to mention one thing real quick. There's a cross reference here, and I think if you look at it from keeping silent is hold one's peace, and to not speak is to use words in order to declare one's mind, then I don't think that excludes singing, because that's not declaring one's mind. You're praising. Right? We even have that as a praising God, and Jesus in Hebrews is essentially part of the sacrificial system. And then you also have with prophesying, right? That's really, you're speaking what God said to tell you. You're not speaking one's own mind or one's opinion, but you're actually speaking the word of God. But the cross reference, because it's earlier in the book, is 1 Corinthians 11, chapter 11, verse 5. It says, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. And same thing here. I think if you apply that context of speaking one's own opinion, well, that's not prayer. And prayer is not necessarily out loud, but it can be. But it's not speaking one's opinion. It's communing with God. And prophesying, if you're using, you're speaking what God is telling you to speak, even if it's out loud. I think if we don't use that rigid of a definition for speaking and being silent, then I think it meshes actually pretty nice, at least in my opinion.
Sure. Well, I'll let you have the last word. So,
all right,
let's trundle off to 1 Timothy 2, or 1 Timothy, anyways. So, 1 Timothy 1. So verse 4, verse 3 and 4. Instruct certain people, telling Timothy, instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine, not to occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculations rather than the divine training that is known by faith. So, so let's just talk a little bit about Ephesus. At that time, the temple to Artemis, which is the foundation is still there, I guess, was one of the 7 wonders of the world at that time. So that's what Ephesus was known for. In the book of Acts, it talks about, the King James, it says Diana, and in the other modern translations, it says Artemis. So it was Diana in Rome, and it was Artemis in Ephesus. They were two different Greek gods, but they did syncretism. So I think it's Sabile, Artemis, Diana, and there's another one. Those were all considered to be the same god with different names. And this, people occupying themselves with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculation. So they're taking these different Greek gods and they're looking at the genealogies and then speculating about how they are all the same. So in 1 Timothy 2, in Acts, Paul says something about Artemis, and there's a riot, right? There's a riot because he's preaching against Artemis. They're in the Colosseum. There's that huge event, and all of the people of the town are against Paul because he's preached against Artemis. So using the name of Artemis in his letter, I think would cause a ruckus. So it's kind of like where if I say Orange Man bad, you know who I'm talking about, right?
No, we just
I don't need
canceled.
right? I don't need to say the guy's name.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody knows who we're talking about. So if you're living in Ephesus, Artemis and the temple, this isn't, the corner barbershop where if you are bald, you don't go there. Everybody is involved in this. It's what the town is known for. It's the draw of the place. So in Acts, Paul quotes two different Greek philosophers, and one of the ones that he quotes is Epimenides. So I don't know. I should have this ready. We started a little early, and I didn't.
My fault.
Get it ready.
I was like, "Let's go, Jordan."
Yeah. So he quotes Epimenides, and you can look up the full poem of Epimenides. Paul quotes Epimenides twice in Acts, and he quotes from Epimenides and Titus. So when it says all Cretans are liars in Titus, and we're like, oh, Cretans are stupid. But that was the point. Epimenides was a Cretan. So when Epimenides said all Cretans are liars, that's what's called the liar's paradox. I'm an American and I say all Americans are liars. Well, did I just tell the truth?
Yeah.
Then you know what I'm saying? So that's called the liar's paradox, and that's what Epimenides used. Zeus married Leto. Leto was his wife, Leto, and Leto had twins. And the twins were Apollos and Artemis. And the genealogies were important because it mattered who was born first. So if you were in the cult of Apollos, you hated the cult of Artemis because you believed that Apollos was born first and Artemis was born second. And the people in the cult of Artemis taught that Artemis was born first and Apollos was born second. And because Greek mythology is so important. Yeah, here it is. All right, here's the poem. They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one. Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But you are not dead. You live and abide forever. For in you we live and move and have our being. So Paul uses the last line from that poem for in Christ we live and move and have our being. So he's relating what Epimenides said about Zeus. So Paul would have known the whole poem, and then he quotes from the second line in Titus. So there's a lot of scriptural evidence that Paul knew the whole poem, and it's only one paragraph long. So Zeus and Leto had twins, Apollos and Artemis. Who was born first is what mattered. The people in Ephesus practiced syncretism. So when they looked at like Diana in Rome, they matched up Diana with Artemis. Cybele was another one that they said was Artemis. And there's another goddess too that they said was Artemis. So if people in Ephesus were getting saved, they were almost certainly being saved out of believing in the cult of Artemis, because that's what the whole town basically was. The silversmiths made their living off the worship and sale of trinkets for Artemis. The whole Colosseum filled up to protest Paul because it's important to everybody. He's taking away their living. So if you're saved out of the cult of Artemis and you come into this new Christian church, you're not going to see a copy of the Old Testament. That another thing that N.T. Wright talks about is that if you were wealthy, you might own a copy of one of the books of the Tanakh, but you wouldn't own it all. And if you were extremely wealthy, you might own a copy of 2 or more books of the Old Testament. So this New Testament church almost certainly didn't have copies of the Tanakh. They heard the Genesis story word of mouth. So if you're Paul or Timothy and you tell them the Ephesians story and then Paul leaves, and Paul says, I want you to stay here and preach against the people that are doing this very thing. They're coming into the church and they're saying that these genealogies matter, and they're matching up Adam and Eve with Apollos and Artemis. So if Adam is Apollos and Eve is Artemis, then Eve was born first and Adam was born second, because the birth order matters. And when you were pregnant, you had a 50-50 chance of dying in childbirth. So where you went to be kept safe through childbearing is you went and you sacrificed to Artemis. So Artemis was the goddess that would keep you safe through childbearing. So when you look at 1 Timothy verse 1, where Paul says, this is what people are doing. They are, they're occupying themselves with myths about Zeus, Leto, Artemis, Apollos. They're using endless genealogies that promote speculations. So they're using these endless genealogies to speculate that Adam is Apollos and Eve is Artemis. And I think the reason that Paul didn't just come right out and use the name Artemis in his letter was because he's sending this with someone else. And if they're stopped and they read it and it has the name Artemis in it, it's going to be taken, to the town, the people that are running the town, and they're going to look at it and say, this is inappropriate. We're not going to allow it in our town. So Paul is going to avoid using the name Artemis, writing it in his letter. It's like me saying Orange Man bad and not saying the name of the person. So when you get to 1 Timothy 2:11, that women should learn in quietness and submission, that what makes sense to me is that these people were saved out of the cult of Artemis. Artemis was formed first, and Eve was formed first, not Adam. Women are superior to men, just like Artemis is superior to Apollos. So the way that Paul can counter that without using the name Artemis is to say to them that this, word authentane, that your women are not to do this, say that they have this inappropriate authority over the men. And the reason they're not to is he turns Epimenides' liar's paradox back around on them. Adam was formed first, then Eve. So if you're going to say that Apollos is Adam and Artemis is Eve, then you're going to have to admit that Apollos was born first and Artemis was born second. See how that, just by him insisting that Adam was formed first and then Eve, it would dismantle their argument that Apollos is Adam and Artemis is Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Then the thing that really tips it off to me is he says, but women will be saved through childbearing, not by going to Artemis. Women are saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So when I look at 1 Timothy 2:11 through 15, I see it, as similar to 1 Corinthians 14. This isn't just, a literal women are to be quiet again, and like I said, if that's what it means, no singing, no teaching, no instruction, it's silence. You're not even supposed to talk to the pastor. You're supposed to ask your husband at home because of the law. So, again, when I look at this passage, that's what makes sense to me, that this is Paul saying that there's a problem in this church that has to do with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculation. The myth is about Zeus, Leto, Apollos, and Artemis. They're speculating that Apollos is Adam, Artemis is Eve. That means that, and that is why women have authority over men in the church, because Eve is Artemis. So that's my thought on that passage, that's, why it's written that way, why it doesn't say Artemis, because of the problems that would cause for the small church in the town, and could even stop the letter from being delivered to the church. So does that make sense? Do you have questions?
It does. It took me a while to see where you're going with it, but then I was like, okay, it's Adam and Eve hierarchy here. So if you think he's correcting them on their understanding of the Genesis 2 hierarchy, then wouldn't that affirm the traditional understanding of the chapter that it is saying men are in authority over women in the church?
Well, I think that when Paul talks about authority between men and women, that it's always husbands over wives. It's not all men over all women. He even says that instead of men over women, he says man over a woman. So it's not that all men have authority over all women. A man only has authority over the woman that he marries. And in marriage, the Ephesians, it's Ephesians 5, right? Where wives are to submit to their husbands.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm kind of baffled that people read that and think that that's oppressive to women, because that had to be incredibly revolutionary and controversial at the time he said it, because all a wife has to do is submit. A husband has to love his wife as Christ loved the church. Christ laid down his life and died for the church. And when I've talked to, women that have, said, well, if I become a Christian, I have to submit to my husband. I say, well, how hard would it be to submit to a husband who loves you and is willing to give up his life for you and treats you the way that Christ treats his church? It's like all you have to do is respect him. You don't even have to love him. The command, the command is submit and respect,
Yeah.
to submit out of respect. And you don't have to submit to doing things that are immoral. You only have to, submit in things that are moral. And the husband is commanded to love you as Christ loved the church. It just, to me, that passage, it's like the men should be complaining, not the wives.
Yeah, that is a
You know
harder
what I'm
job. I
saying?
think. Yeah. Oh, I completely agree.
At that time, the saying was when a man rolled out of bed in the morning and his feet hit the floor, he would say, "Thank God I wasn't born a woman." That's how bad it was. If if a man said to his wife, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you," they were divorced, and she could only leave with what she carried. What she could carry. I mean, and then for Paul to come along and say that wives or husbands have to love their wives as Christ loved the church. You have to be willing to die for your wife. You can't divorce
Yeah.
her when she burns your food, which is
Yeah.
what the Jews said at the time.
Yeah. What a profession of true love, right?
Yeah. So to
Yeah.
me, Paul does, have, like you say, a hierarchy in marriage, but not between men and women. I don't see that there's a hierarchy anywhere else. So, and I don't know how long we've been going. This is probably getting too long. And I'd probably want to look up all of the other verses first, but
Yeah. Well, let me respond to that. I think,
yeah.
I would say there's three categories. So is there a general hierarchy of men and women? I don't think so. Just in general, like I walk on the street and I see a woman, I go, haha, what can I tell her to do? I have authority over her. I would say there is authority and a hierarchy within marriage, within the family unit. I would say there's also a hierarchy within the church, the ecclesia. And I think, when you said, "Oh, I don't see anything other than men and women," and I would point to the last chapter we talked about, because the way I would read that is it does seem to stipulate a hierarchy for men and women within the church, and I would say 1 Timothy chapter 2 does that as well. And I would still apply what I was saying earlier about just this almost like meddling anti-authority kind of thing. I think he's trying to address both with Timothy and also the Church of Corinth. It says to remain quiet. One of the usages of that word in the Greek is to not meddle in others' affairs, which would seem to make sense, right? They need to be submissive. They need to not teach or exercise authority over men, and rather remain quiet, rather not meddle in other affairs. And women here is Gene again, just like we saw in 1 Corinthians, which is a woman of any age, a wife, a betrothed woman, and then when it says a man, an heir, which male, husband, betrothed man, but also could be generally anyone. But in the context, it seems like if we're stating women, then we're stating men. And not exercise authority, that seems to jive, in my opinion, with the next chapter, right? When it's instantiating the two offices of elder and deacon, or bishop and deacon, however you want to say that. And then again, it says husband of one, Gene. So that seems to stipulate specifically the gender of who they're married to, which seems to then infer the gender of the ones holding those offices, which seems to be instantiating a hierarchy there. And I would say that follows again with the same requirements he gives Titus in Titus 1 for who he needs to seek out in every town in the island of Crete for the leadership of each church he's creating. And I think with the reference to Adam and Eve in verse 13 and so on, I think he's referring back, which I think we'd agree on a little bit, at least the hierarchy of birth order, creation order, not birth, from Genesis 2 and 3, right? Adam's formed first, then Eve Eve is deceived, not Adam. Yet Eve is saved through childbirth, and I'd be curious what you think about that. But I would say literally childbirth is, well, she's giving birth to children who, through the lines of genetics, will eventually be Jesus, and whose blood will save even Eve from being deceived from Satan with the blood of Christ, which I think is just so awesome. It's such a cool parallel of even her being deceived, the first one to fall in the deception of Satan, is still covered by the blood through what she produced through childbearing, which I think is really cool. Anyways, and I would also, I think we just don't take it such a rigid view of quiet and silent to really mean this exercise of authority, which Paul seems to be stating. And then I think we can look at other things that Paul says, even to Timothy as well as in Titus, on the roles of women in the church. And it seems like in Titus 2, where he's specifically stating older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good, and to train the young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, so on. And so it seems like there are teaching roles for women that Paul is stating, but they are to teach the younger women. They are to teach the children. So that hierarchy still seems to be maintained. It's not that silent as in never utter any noise, but specifically it's this exercise in authority, and to essentially not meddle in some of the church authority that is being created. At least that's my 2 cents. That's how I read it.
Yeah. I mean, I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. But then Paul commends Priscilla for teaching Apollos, and people say, well, you just can't do it in the pulpit. I'm like, they met every day of the week in houses. How do you get that women just can't be in the pulpit? And about the verse 13 and 14, Adam formed first, then Eve. Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. To me, I see that as the cherry on top, where Paul isn't just saying, Adam was formed first. And if you're going to say Adam is Apollos, you're going to have to say Apollos was born first and Artemis was born second. But if Artemis is Eve, it wasn't Adam that was deceived, it was the woman. And by saying the woman, he's saying, look, if you're saying that Artemis was Eve, then you have to say that the woman Artemis was the one who was deceived. And do you really want, if you're going to say that Artemis is Eve because you're going to uphold Eve as Artemis, just like you're worshiping Artemis now, if you're going to have to say that Artemis was the one that was deceived and became a sinner, I mean, I don't know. I just read that and, women will be saved through childbearing instead of, because that's what Artemis was. Artemis was the goddess who kept women safe through childbearing. So by going to Artemis, women were saved through childbearing. So
do you read the same Artemis stuff with the earlier verses with the braided hair and the gold and pearls?
I think that's the culture of that town being brought into the church. So yeah, he's telling them the appropriate dress to come to church. Instead of dressing like you're going to the temple to worship Artemis, this is how you dress to come to the church to worship Christ and become more like Christ.
So
like I said, I see it referring back to chapter 1 with the myths and endless genealogies and promoting speculations.
Well, like in verse 9 where he's like, you're saying he's specifically talking to the women in the church and say, hey, don't dress like this. And then verse 11, he goes, actually, I'm not talking about you at all. I'm referring back to this Artemis character.
I'm saying that he's still saying to the women, you need to learn in quietness and submission. I don't permit women to teach or assume authority, to authentain over men, which is that instead of, because Paul says that all men and all women, all believers are to submit to one another. So it's not like he says women are to submit and he never tells men to submit. He tells all believers, men and women, to submit to each other. So saying that women should learn in quietness and full submission, he says that to men as well. It's not like that's only directed to women, because everybody's told to submit to one another in the church. So, but he's rebuking them for what they're doing that is wrong. They're coming to church dressed like they're going to the temple of Artemis, and they're coming to church and promoting the myth of Artemis and Apollos and as Adam and Eve. So that's what he's dealing with here, is he's saying you're dressing like you're going to the temple. You need to dress like you're coming to a Christian church to worship Christ, and
I'd agree with you there.
that's, that's appropriate behavior.
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to be, having improper authority over the men in the church. The women are not superior to the men as you think they are because of the cult of Artemis. So, and this is how I can tell you that Adam isn't Apollos and Eve isn't Artemis without using their names and causing trouble and possibly having my letter stopped from even getting to you. Verse 15, I don't know how you make sense of that verse without it being about fertility goddess.
Like I was saying, that's where Jesus comes from. Through Eve's childbirth.
Oh, right. I mean,
Savior.
Yeah, N.T. Wright, he said, and I believe it was on a DVD I was watching him, he was talking about just taking the context, learning the context before just, reading the verses. Well, that's what it says. You need to learn the context and the history and, all of that. He said, if you think that what 1 Timothy 2:15 means, that women will be saved through childbearing, you probably don't. So it was interesting that he used that specific verse, to warn against people just reading it, and taking it like,
I
call it biblical literalism. I think you guys call it taking a verse wooden literalism, without taking the context. And like I said, I'm not trying to go and just invent this stuff. It's Paul quotes from this poem in Acts and Titus. I just went and looked it up,
Yeah.
And it's not a stretch to find that Zeus and Leto were the parents of Apollos, and Artemis were twins, and that those two cults hated each other. And at that time that this letter was written, that would be like me saying Orange Man bad, and you would know exactly what I'm talking about. So I don't think that anybody that was there at that time that listened to this letter didn't immediately know that when Paul says Adam was formed first and then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived, that they didn't immediately know that he was talking about Apollos and Artemis. Especially when he goes, women will be saved through childbearing, not by worshiping Artemis or worshiping Eve, but by continuing in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So, and I wanted to talk about these two passages because, like Mike, I think, I have respect for Mike. He says these are the only two passages that he can't get around. So I just wanted to give people another perspective and, to hear somebody else listen to it and tell me if I'm insane, but there you go.
And I would say just the literal part, like I've always thought when someone says take a passage literally, I would say in its proper historic context, with its proper historic audience. Otherwise, it's not literal. Then it's just whatever you think the context is, which is now figurative.
Yeah.
So that's how I always look at it. And, other people would say maybe like the plain reading. The plain reading says this. It might, you know. I tend to give a lot of credence to the plain reading just because of we can all come up with very fancy ways of getting around verses that we don't like or cause problem for our doctrine. But I think, you know, it's fun to talk to you about this, Jordan, because yeah, like I said, it's a subject I'm willing to have my mind changed on. Obviously, in our culture, it would be way easier if I changed my mind on this than held my current belief. Probably a lot fewer YouTube censorships, but it's a fun topic to talk about, and I think we both have a desire to know it truthfully. So that's great.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You know, you talk about the plain reading, and I'm like, well, I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. Then why does Paul, the plain reading is that Priscilla taught Apollos, you know, and I'm trying to make it not contradict itself. You know what I'm saying? So that's why when I read it, I'm like, well, wait a minute, there's a contradiction here. Maybe this is about something different. So
are you referencing Acts 18 that we're talking about?
I think it's 17. Let me look real quick here. Oh, it's 19.
Like 1826 says, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him and explained to him the way of God more accurately.
Okay, yeah, I didn't have that reference, so yeah, I didn't know where that was.
Yeah, thankfully from our Nick interview, I had every single reference to women in the New Testament pulled up. So
okay,
single document I created.
Yeah, it's Acts 17:28. When Paul was in Athens, he quotes Epimenides and Aratus. For in him we live and move and have our being. That's Epimenides. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. That's Aratus. Aratus. I don't know how you pronounce that.
Don't ask me about biblical names. I always get them wrong.
Yeah. So, one of the things that really helped me with this, I guess, if I'm right, my son went on a trip to Turkey, and they went to the temple of Artemis.
Oh,
and
cool.
There's a statue of Artemis still there. And the picture is like her whole chest, you know, from like her shoulders to her belly button is rows of breasts.
Oh.
And I looked at that and I was like, you know, I'm thinking of Artemis as, you know, this statue holding a sword or, you know, this, and here it is. It's this kind of crude thing of just, and you know, and then I looked it up and I'm like, oh, she was a fertility goddess. You know, you would go to Artemis to be saved through childbearing, to be kept safe through childbearing. And that's when it kind of clicked for me. I'm like, man, I need to look up who Artemis was, you know, and then you just go to the, you know, the thumbnail sketch and it's like Zeus, Leto, Apollos, Artemis, people in Artemis hated the cult on Apollos. You don't even have to dig for it. It's like, you know, first page of Wikipedia. So
when you said that
really helped me, you know,
her chest, I thought you were going to say, and then on her chest was written 1 Timothy chapter 2.
1
like,
Timothy 2.
was right, I confess.
That's it.
It's been there the whole time. I didn't know.
There and, you know, take a chisel. Yeah. So 1 Timothy 3, you know, obviously I'm going to have a different take than you do, but that would, if you're interested in talking about it, that would be, I have, you know, obviously a little bit different take there. So it would be a you know, Episcopos and poema.
Mm-hmm.
So those would be what we'd have to talk about, but that's a different, you know, a long explanation.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I did a word study on both of those for Sunday school at church, and that was kind of a fun one just to see the different references and just what are the church offices and what does it mean. We did one with the Bible Bro Down about that too, which was kind of fun.
Yeah, and I think it's possible that you can be a poema and not be an episcopos. You know, like Timothy is a young man and he's a shepherd, he's a poema of the church, but he wouldn't be an episcopos, he wouldn't be an elder. so I think that those can be separate. And, when I look, when you Google that, are those separate offices? It's like, well, they need to be the same because then women can't be pastors is kind of the feeling that you get, There's no reason that I could find that Episcopos and Poema have to be the same. That if you're a Poema, you have to be an Episcopos, and if you're, if you're a Poema, you have to be an Episcopos. So I think they're separate.
That would be a fun episode to do.
Yeah, so we'll do that another time. But I got to do more research. I need to be prepared when you have my Word document open instead of in the middle.
We'll just edit that out, and then no one will know.
Oh, all right. Yeah, if you can do that, that'd be great. So, all right, man. It's been an hour, right?
Yeah, a little bit over an hour.
So,
well, thanks, Jordan. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks. This was enjoyable. So,
and look, we disagreed and we still had fun, and we're still friends.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.